So we finally did it. We got you.
Yeah, you wrote me in. I was admittedly kind of skimming through your last talk on postmodernism just to see what you guys were engaging with. So that was interesting. And I do mean skim. So I got like the gist of what you guys were talking about, I think, just to see what basically what the discussion was about.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that's the main thing, right? Like about postmodernism. How do you see it coming into like anthropology and your research?
Well, those are two very broad questions. I guess for the anthropology one specifically, do you want me to like highlight how I understand the history, or how do I see it in reference to my work?
I guess more specific to you. And then we can talk about the history a little bit too, because I'm
Sure.
sure Bryant isn't really familiar with it. And I
Yeah.
think, yeah, it's kind of in some ways murky.
Sure. So I guess just to frame who I am, which also kind of ties into this as well, I primarily see myself kind of as a constructivist and kind of a reluctant structuralist. And a constructivist, for those that are unfamiliar, basically is more or less what postmodernism is kind of espousing, and that is knowledge is constructed and does not exist in a vacuum, basically. So everything that we understand really is our perception of understanding that thing, really, right? That makes any sense. But in terms of being a structuralist, that really means that it's hard for me to look at, let's say, health inequalities and not say that there is some reality to that, right? So, for instance, there's health inequalities related to the environmental injustice, economic disparities, social and economic policies that have kind of shaped health and disease risk, as an example. It's hard for me to say that doesn't exist, or I can't say that exists, right? Which is more of a more hardline postmodernist sort of philosophy or thought. But I would say how the two interface, at least for me, is those systems I just talked about are socially constructed and they're understood socially also too, and they're kind of built together with everyone kind of participating in that process. So when we're talking about, let's say, health inequalities, we have to talk about, okay, what do we mean by that specifically? So we can talk about like structural racism as an example, and that itself is, of course, both history and historical, as well as a social construct, but it has biological consequences that are very much real and not something that we can just hand wave and say, oh, I just can't say for sure this actually exists, because we see evidence of it obviously existing, right? But
Mm.
for me, as a medical anthropologist specifically, how I see postmodernism, I kind of take it pragmatically. So, for instance, like I'm very hesitant to make causal inferences about really anything. And I get very uncomfortable when people do that. Say, this is causing this. This is the reason that they have, for instance, a mental disability or a mental illness, right?
Yeah.
Because for me, it's kind of reductionist and it's most likely multi causal, right? So for me, at least, postmodernism is saying, okay, we just need to understand how we understand things at the
Mhm.
very least, and how that knowledge is co-constructed on the one hand, but also is reproduced by us as scholars, how we interface with, let's say, participants and how they understand what we're talking about, and like how we prescribe, let's say, this is the cause of this. Why do they think that is the case? That kind of thing. So for me, it really is just built understandings that are collectively sort of participated in as both, let's say, as a researcher and both as a participant, as an example, but also participants' knowledge is going to shape our own understanding and our own ability to make inferences, as an example, also too. So I look at primarily mosquito-borne infectious diseases, which is a very positivist sort of understanding of health. For instance, you get dengue fever, therefore this is going to cause this biological consequence. Somatically, you're going to experience X and Y symptoms usually, but not always. But also, those diseases are shaped by social processes, right? And also, people, as an example, as a anthropologist studying health, when I went to Belize, where I do a lot of my work the first time, I just sort of assumed that people would be concerned about Zika virus, right?
Mm.
Because of the complications it may have related to pregnancy and microcephaly, as an example. However, when I was getting there, what I found was really people didn't really have a, I don't want to say good understanding, because that also is me kind of prescribing what I'm seeing onto their experiences. For me, it's they just didn't really think about it as a concern for them, right? And actually, a very well-known anthropologist sitting in my conference presentation, Lynn Morgan, brought that question up, saying, "Okay, you're assuming that they care, but why should they care, right? Like you're an anthropologist, you're assuming they're caring because this is a health concern that you're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
However, for them, they have a this is me talking now, not Lynn Morgan. They have a cascading amount of other things that are on their mind. They're thinking about, let's say, their next meal. They're thinking about dengue fever as a bigger health concern than Zika virus, as an example. So for them, Zika virus is on. When I say them, I also mean my participants. And this is not also, again, me. This is me being postmodern and saying that I can't say this for everybody. But I
Mm-hmm.
am saying that a lot of people that I talked with, and I'm talking about doctors, I'm talking about community members, I'm talking about business owners, they were concerned about Zika virus as an economic concern, as an example, as a tourist location in a tropical environment. So they were saying Zika virus is more a concern for me because I'm afraid that tourists might not want to come here or they're canceling their reservations. Not so much that they're caring about the health consequences of the disease. So this to me was an example of sort of how an understanding of something is going to shape, let's say, risk factors or the likelihood of getting even infections, as an example, too. Because if men aren't caring about Zika virus as a potential concern because they can't get pregnant, they're not going to be too concerned about wearing a condom, as an example, or wearing mosquito spray, as an example, also, too, because it's not a concern for them. And that is sort of where I started to pivot my more recent research is on concern and how does concern sort of encapsulate people's understandings of a certain, let's say, a disease or a health condition, and how does that concern shape risk for a disease also too. So again, it's me kind of pragmatically saying different people's experiences matter, they very much do so, and those experiences are going to shape expectations and behaviors, right? Which again kind of ties into a more positivist approach, right? So like people think this way, therefore they're going to do this thing, which doesn't always apply, but it's a good way to sort of think about risk. And but again, it's a sort of positivist approach. So I have to often wrestle with my postmodern and constructivist inclinations while looking at, let's say, a health condition that has biological consequences that you can't just hand wave and say these are just personal experiences or subjective experiences also too. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is that
Yeah.
how you see, I guess, postmodernism generally, like as more of like looking at subjective experience as trying to not impose different models of health or concern or a research focus on your population? Is that how you would sort of
Yeah.
position postmodernism?
And I would also say postmodernism, just to add to that, is also our our ability to sort of construct how we got to where we are today. So, like for instance, with anthropology, we had this thing called field work. We just go out there and we do field work, we collect data, but that process itself needs to be broken apart. It needs to be pieced together and said, okay, well, how did you do field work? How did you do field work? Right? Because we always just assume there's this thing called field work that everyone can just implicitly do as an anthropologist.
Yeah.
And it's going to be more or less the same when you go out there. However, your subjective experience, let's say for me, example, as a heterosexual, cisgendered, white male researcher doing work on a disease that primarily impacts pregnant women in a foreign country, that's going to shape my lens on the topic, as well as people's understandings of me as a research instrument, if you want to call it that, and the kind of
Mhm.
data that I'm able to get access to. So you must think about every single one of those aspects, a postmodernist would say, when you're collecting data, because you really don't know what your own perspective and positionality is going to bring to the table. And of course, I'm talking about things that also parallel with feminist thought and theory too, right? And I can go on a tangent about how
Mhm.
some feminists argue that postmodernism is just a white man's feminism. Also,
Mhm.
too, I can go on that tangent, and I
Yeah.
probably will at some point in this thing. But um, that sort of is the thing: is postmodernism and feminism are kind of saying the same thing in some aspects, and that's we must understand your own positionality and understand also that whatever you're writing is implicitly going to be a fiction. But when I say fiction, again, so I know we have a psychologist here, right, Bryant? Yeah,
Yeah.
Partly.
yeah. So I actually was really curious when I heard that there'd be one of you here because I wasn't sure exactly how the larger discipline of psychology sort of interfaces, if at all, with postmodernist thought, because I always sort of have psychology as like the boogeyman of like positivist thought, and again, broad strokes kind of brushing here.
Yeah.
But I mentioned that briefly because for me, at least, I do see postmodernism in the sort of the Latourian light of you can take it too far, but at the same time, you still kind of need it. Like people are messy, people have agency. So to say that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, I don't agree with concerning postmodernism. But again, it depends on the research aims. And if I'm doing a project in Belize, I'm probably going to be taking a more structuralist, structural violence approach to research that doesn't really mesh that well with postmodernism as it was originally conceptualized as a text. And that's what I meant to say when I was going on this tangent in the beginning, right? So when I'm saying or anthropology says that everything you write is a fiction, I think people misconstrue that to mean that nothing matters. What it really just means is that you're going to bias everything you write. Your lens is biased, right?
Yeah.
The data you collect, how you talk to people, and how you write about the data is all going to be a fiction in the sense that there is no objective reality that can be written on paper when you're talking about the experiences of people, because you yourself are going to bias that process, and so are all the participants also too. Not to say their experiences don't matter, because everything matters, but everything is not objective. I think is like the point of calling it a fiction, I would say. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I was reading an article recently by Emily Martin, the one that she wrote in like 2014 about like an early psychological expedition with like W.H.R. Rivers and a bunch of other people who went to like, another culture, being around them with the idea that if they were around them for long enough, that their own insights and their new subjectivity, their ideas, thoughts, the way they thought, the way they saw things in the world, were going to be akin to the natives that they were with. That was sort of an assumption back then, and it never really panned out, of course. But it's interesting to see how back then psychologists were trying to figure out how to get in another person's mind. And I think on that note, Bryant, I guess I'm wondering like how much in your personal like experience did you even deal with like any of these things that Deven's talking about?
Is there something more specifically? Because I know he talked about a lot.
I did.
It is. I guess postmodernism. Like, did that concept ever even come up, or?
If it did, it was very minimally, I think.
Yeah.
And I don't even think they used that label to describe, what they were teaching us at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to compare it to anthropology, I did have several professors that did take a more anthropology approach to our fieldwork in terms of, like learning how not to be biased and really trying to see the community's perspective and what they're looking for and what kind of help they're looking for, as opposed to, just unloading our own biases and what we think is best for them. But postmodernism, I really can't say we went into that because we were taught the old school theorists. There was not much modern theory, at least in my program. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, also too, just to jump in, a lot of anthropologists also are very uncomfortable with postmodern theory too. There's a lot of them that but there are a lot of individuals that take a very more positivist approach, and that's totally fine. I'm not saying that should be discounted. I think anthropology, because it is so diffuse, it has people just doing literally everything, and people are going to disagree about almost every single theory we bring to the table, too, which I think is a strength, but also can be a weakness because it doesn't have that sort of, I don't know if linear is the word, but it doesn't have that sort of trajectory that like, okay, we can agree on this, let's move forward with this and do things. right?
Yeah.
That I think psychology does a much better job at doing, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think interestingly enough, because I've been getting more into like philosophy stuff, which is why I had Sam on my, the last podcast, and it's as diffuse as anthropology is. Like it is
Mhm.
just everywhere. And in my undergrad, like I first heard of postmodernism as a sort of like really terrible perspective towards research. Like, that was my undergrad
Mm.
experience, and not with all the professors, but with one in particular. And the way that I learned about postmodernism is like, you know what, you know, kind of like how a public figure like Jordan Peterson talks about postmodernism as like leading to nihilism and like sort of throwing your hands up and nothing matters. That's how like one of my professors talked about it too. Like
Mm.
postmodernists believe that your research doesn't matter because it's just biased and you can't really do anything. And that professor said it in a way of saying, I consider myself a scientist and my research does matter. Like there's, for her, was like a pragmatics to it and an impact of the research thing as well. And I guess the thing that has occurred to me since then, I mean, that's like 10 years ago now, is like I've never actually met anyone who used postmodernism like that ever. Like I
Mm.
think that's one of the interesting things is postmodernism becomes um sort of this catch-all term for, I don't know, I want to say like you're stupid, but kind of like what's even the point? Like why are you even
Yeah.
going down that rabbit hole when I don't think I've ever met anyone who actually applied it that way.
Um, and I mean, I would agree. And honestly, I was just going through Latour again. We will never be modern, and he's saying the opposite thing really about in critique of postmodernism, saying they think that there's this super hardcore modernist body of scholars that say like no experience matters whatsoever. We're just going to use archaeology as an example. We're going to find a piece of pottery, record it, and that's all we do. There are some people that do that too, but I think Latour is also saying that there's just like postmodernism is there to contrast objectivity, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, while postmodernism can just lead to nihilism, saying like, nothing matters, again, I've never met someone that actually prescribes themselves to that. You can't do work from that perspective. Like it's impossible to do anything if you're saying nothing matters. Again, you'll probably find scholars that do that kind of work. Say like, hey, like I just talked to people and this is what they said. Sure, but
Hmm.
I think it goes also to the aims of your research. Like if you're researching something, that's different than like prescribing or describing something also too, right? So I don't know. It's just interesting to me in that regard, I guess.
Um, Let me ask, like, so when it comes to, you know, we can't say that there's objective truth and everything is subjective. So I guess I asked, like, what is, I guess, what is the point then? At what point do we say
Hmm.
like this is true, or we're just, this is just our experience and that's it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that. Something could be asked, so thank you for bringing it up. And for me, it's just I don't know. Like I think it's very easy. Like even in my own earlier writing as like a master's student, as an example, my advisor at the time would constantly yell at me because I would throw in words like probably or most likely when I was writing something because I'm very hesitant to say this is this, right? She says you're not saying anything when you keep throwing in these little qualifiers in there.
Hmm.
And if you're not saying anything, what's really the point of doing the research to begin with? Like, I think it depends on your objective. If your objective is to just get people's experiences and talk about them, that's great. However, if you're trying to actually find something, that's when you need to start putting on different hats, in my opinion. Like, I can't think of anyone that's like, I am just a postmodernist. I
Yeah.
am just this light label because it's very constraining. And maybe you could do that, let's say, decades ago, and just talk about like going to like the newer village and this is what people did when they were walking around. But then we look at that lens, really put a lens on of looking backwards and saying, well, this is very problematic, right? This is like a, for instance, again, like a white man talking about, let's say, sexual relationships in this village. That's itself going to be a biased perspective because he as an outsider is going to have a different understanding. But I bring this up because for me, it's just you can kind of, what's the phrase I'm thinking of? You can kind of just sit on your hands and do nothing, and I don't think that's an issue either. I guess my hesitance is saying you need to do something. You need to find something to do your research also too. I don't think that's necessarily the case. If you're like, again, I just think at the end of the day, it's like, what is our goal, right? And I don't think there is a broad disciplinary goal that applies to, let's say, psychology or to anthropology. We need to answer this question. We need to do these things. I think if that was the case, it'd be very incredibly constraining, and we couldn't get and everything else about the human experience would be kind of thrown out the window. So for me, I think that it is important to do things, I guess, like from an applied standpoint. But I also think there is room to just talk to people too, if that makes any sense, at least for me.
Yeah.
Again, I at the University of South Florida, where Will and I are at, it's an applied program. So we're supposed to go out and do things, go change the world, right? But I mean, even people in this department say, I don't consider myself to be an applied anthropologist. I was talking to a professor yesterday, and she's like, I'm kind of just in this program, but like I don't feel like I really like belong here. So I'm not trying to like actively change something. I'm just doing research, right? So again, I think like we can have a broad paradigm or goal, but I don't think anyone like is that robotic where like they must always do this one thing either. That applies to human behavior. It also applies to researchers as humans that have their own behaviors also too. So to me, I think it's just messy. Postmodernism is a very messy thing, but people are messy, right? And people are going to take that in different directions too. And that applies to all sorts of research. And I think it's constraining to say, like, this is what research is. If you're not doing this, you are not doing research. You're not a scientist. You're not a researcher, right? At least that's how I conceptualize anthropology as a very broad discipline, but I'm sure that also applies to other disciplines also too.
You mentioned like, what's the research goal, right? Like, and I think that's a really interesting question, because is the goal something like being able to generalize in some way, right? And that's the thing with like speaking to people and finding out what they're doing, especially when it's bound to a certain time, a certain place, maybe a certain social event is occurring, like generalizability is kind of hard. And I think I hear you sort of speaking to that, like what's the overall purpose of it? At the same time, I wonder, like, aside from generalizability, we also have the issue of like, we have issues coming up in other disciplines, right? Like I think the replicability crisis, and mostly in like psychology, right? That we've realized that a lot of I guess a more positive, research studies haven't really been able to be replicated, right? And that's because, I don't know, it's like maybe it is more messy, kind of like you're talking about, right? It's more messy, and how can we account for that? Do you think postmodernism tries to account for that?
To me, in my opinion, postmodernism, again, I'm broad strokes here, and it's not a monolithic entity at all. But I think it just says, hey, you can't ignore that it's messy, right? That's how I use postmodernism, pragmatically, is saying we can't just say this is how people are. They are all ones and zeros. They of course aren't, right? So for me, it's just saying, hey, people have agency. At the end of the day, that's sort of how I understand postmodernism. You have agency, and people are not always going to act quote unquote rationally than as you would expect them to. So let's take like food insecurity as an example. It's been found, like in positivist research as an example, that if you give, let's say, food stamps to people that are food insecure, you would assume, you hypothesize that they're going to use those food stamps to then go get food. But then, let's say after the project is over, you find out that people were not using the food stamps because they were concerned about the stigma of using food stamps in the grocery store. Right? So people are going to have a different understanding and relationship to objects in their world, and also their understanding of, let's say, stigma and social relationships that is very hard to account for in a very positivist project that says they're going to use this thing to do this thing because they want to survive. They need food. People just don't act that way. And for me, that's sort of why I'm always sort of like poking the bear when I see very positivist papers or scholars or researchers saying, okay, like you found this, but doesn't mean this is exactly reality. This is what you were looking for. Which is also postmodernism saying you're inherently biasing your project because you're looking for this thing. But everything is bias. So is that bad? That's just what you were looking for. But you need to have that little addendum or disclaimer on your research that says, hey, this is why we did this. We're probably missing this, as an example.
Yeah.
And if that's missing, I get very uncomfortable, I would say.
Itchy.
Yeah, itchy is my word.
Yeah. That's what Deven says when, something it seems kind of problematic. It's itchy. He gets itchy.
It's just frustrating to me that people think of postmodernism as like a kind of a dirty word, like Will was saying earlier. And I have heard that before. I've been given readings as a student that says like this is this thing that no one really does because like it's really out there. They kind of throw it in with like, let's say as an example, phenomenology. Not to discount phenomenology, but also people discount that as like, oh, people are just talking about their experience looking at a painting and what's that really matter? This is not research. But why isn't it, right? Like who gets to define what research is? And who gets to define that you need to look for generalizability to do your research? Like this must be generalizable for you to make claims about something. It's like we're having to play in the quantitative big leagues, but we have a very small bat when we're doing anthropology work, and we're trying to still play the game by their rules. Because if we don't, then people think of the work as less than. So I think that's why, plus the acknowledgement that it is very useful as a perspective, that we're seeing a lot more cultural anthropologists start to do sort of, or medical anthropologists start to do more like biocultural stuff that kind of entangles cultural understandings and expectations and belief systems with biological processes as a way to say these both matter. But then it comes to the question, okay, what matters more? That always is the next question. Is this because of biology primarily? Is this because of culture? Why can't it be both? Is my sort of a take on it also too. But I don't know. I think that overall things are just getting more messy and more entangled, and I'm totally happy to be in that chaos myself in terms of research.
Yeah. I spoke with Dr. Daniel Lendy, and he talked about like that biocultural approach of it being like a feedback loop ultimately, like with biological, what's happening biologically, what happens culturally and socially, contextually, right? Like that's, I think a lot of biocultural research looks at the sociocultural context as context of the biology. And earlier you said everything's biased, right? And I'm sure a lot of people who heard that were like, man, that's uncomfortable, right? Like everything's biased. And I guess in respect to biocultural research, how do you see that?
Well, I mean, biocultural, as I see it, is an attempt to say, okay, yeah, everything is messy. And it kind of came out, or it stemmed out of critique saying, you're just looking at biology, you're just looking at culture. So people were like, okay, well, we should probably look at both then, right? So people started looking at both things. But then at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to broil down the human experience embodiment into, let's say, 5 to 10 variables. This is not possible. So things will always be biased because you can't literally study everything when you're doing research. And that is sort of how I see like this sort of, in my, what I would probably call maybe postmodernism, in my opinion, is saying that, hey, like, sure, like things matter. Like there is reality in the sense that people have bodies and they're affected by their lived experiences. They can get diseases. But also, how do we get to that point? How did they get sick? How did they get treatment? What is the biological consequences, somatic experiences that are kind of expressed when people get sick? And that can go into illness experience and then wellness and talking about health and wellness, disease, illness, those kind of concepts that if you kind of smash them together, that I think does a better job of talking about the human experience. It's not perfect. I think biocultural approaches are not perfect because, and also they're so diffuse. People are doing them in so many different ways that we can't just say, oh, this is good or this is bad. Because people are doing bad research, people are doing good research. That's always the case. But since we can never broil down the entire human experience and essentialize it into a model or a few variables, I think research will always be biased because people are always biased too. That'll never change.
Yeah.
Unless we become robots.
Hmm.
So not there yet, at least.
I wonder, like, okay, just to shake the cage a little bit. um, you know, okay, I think, looking at different perspectives, like a part of those perspectives are, when you look at a structure, when you look at something that's biocultural, right? Like a lot of people have issues with that because, where's the individual in that? Like this notion of like personal responsibility, like, there is something to it, right? Like there's it's culturally charged, surely, like in our culture, that's really a really powerful one, right? Like I think politics right now is divided because of, I think, a part of that notion, or at least a misunderstanding of it, right? Like people who are left leaning are, I guess, stereotypically more concerned with, structural issues and inequalities and violence, whereas I guess more right leaning people seem to be more concerned with, taking, personal responsibility for yourself and starting there. I mean, from there, maybe even your community, your family, but ultimately, like each of us has a role to play, right? And I guess to what extent do you think, I guess, yeah, that the individual plays a part in like an anthropological model, like a biocultural one?
For me, at least, I kind of fall back on Paul Farmer that says it's not right to, let's say, for instance, to pull from his example, to blame a poor Haitian woman for getting HIV because the context in which that she is operating in, that she has to navigate, creates barriers, it creates constraints, and it creates facilitators that can exacerbate her risk for HIV. So if she is poor and for instance she might be practicing survival sex as a form to, for instance, pay for herself or to pay for her children, and then these males that have more power than her don't want to use a condom, and then she gets HIV, is she at fault for getting HIV? I mean, Paul Farmer would say no, because her agency was severely limited. She had a limited amount of options. But if we export that to, let's say, the U.S. and talking about right wing versus left wing, or being a moderate as an example, people's lived experiences, good or ill, privileged or unprivileged, or also talking about multi layers of privilege. Let's say you grew up wealthy, you grew up white. That's 2 layers of privilege. Let's say you're also a man now and you're heterosexual. Let's say 4 layers of interrelated privilege now that is going to shape your understanding of the world. And that may go against or be in contrast to or create tension with people that have different lived experiences and positionalities. Now, anthropology predominantly, I would argue, is a very liberalized liberal discipline. I consider myself to be very liberal in terms of my philosophy also too, and left leaning. However, that's not always the case. But what I'm trying to say also too is you can your environment can shape your behaviors. That doesn't always necessarily mean in terms of your health. It can mean in terms of your relationships to others and how you interact with others too. And even taking like a public health approach, looking at these issues too, when you're looking at like the socio-ecological model, you have yourself as a person, as a biological, living, breathing individual. You have your family, your close friends, your social networks, your job, your neighborhoods, your social environments, your political environments, economics. All of these shape who you are and your lived experiences over the life course of the individual, but those are also going to shape how you perceive the world and also your history growing up in that environment. And you're going to, as an example, see things from that lens. And that's sort of where we get individuals that sort of lean one way or the other, which oftentimes is based on, for instance, if your parents are right wing, you're probably going to be right wing, or vice versa. I'm kind of the weird one where my family is very much on the right side of the spectrum and I'm all the way to the left. So that always isn't the case either. And again, that's just in one part agency in my mind. And also just what I was exposed to, let's say going into like a liberalized university setting also too. It expanded my worldview and education beyond that of which my family and my relatives have in terms of their exposure. Not to say that the education makes me better by any means. It just says like my exposure is different. My expectations of others are different because of that lived experience. And that's going to shape all aspects of myself as an individual, but also my expectations of others and how I interact with others also too. So to me, it's all interconnected. And I don't know if you wanted me to prescribe blame on anything, but to get to your point concerning people's personal responsibility, again, I'm very hesitant to use that term. Not saying people don't have agency, they very much do, but the agency is going to be constrained and shaped by their environment, both historical as well as contemporaneous, for me.
Yeah.
I think that also applies to how anthropology sort of views agency. It's almost like a multiple choice where you have, let's say, 20 options, but you can just decide, okay, I don't have any money, so I can't do that option, so that crosses that off. I live in a poor neighborhood that has high violence, so I'm gonna cross that off. And you get in situations where people kind of like don't have a lot of options, despite supposedly having agency to be able to do whatever they want. I can walk across the streets in heavy traffic if I wanted to. I might get hit by a car, but I have the agency to do so. But I'm probably going to rationalize that, hey, I probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But I could just do it and say, hey, I'm just going to go to Dunkin' Donuts and get my coffee and risk it. I had the ability to make that decision, but my experiences and my understanding of, okay, I don't want to die or get hit by a car is probably going to shape my ability and reasoning process concerning that action, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I think this like notion of what we believe, and I guess like social epistemology, right? Like what knowledge we pay attention to, what we're surrounded by in our upbringing when we grow up. And I think it's also selective. Selective we can be, but at the same time, to a certain extent, I think that's this whole notion of social media and like smartphones. I think it's been really interesting to see how, things are numbers on a screen until they're not, until they bleed into the real world. And I think that's what a lot of social movements have seemed, right? Like people who are more right leaning look at, um, Black Lives Matter protesting as like wild, unreasonable, and dang, I didn't know like it was really this bad, when until it spilled out in the streets. People who are left leaning feel the same way about, what happened at the Capitol. Like, wow, like you see numbers on the screen, you see statistics on who believes what, and people thinking they'll stop the steal for President Trump, but it's not until it like bleeds into reality that it's like something we actually have to deal with.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of realities is interesting because I think to be very postmodern right now, like, yeah, everyone lives in a different reality. And I think it's such an easy example of it in a way that I think we might take for granted.
Yeah, I would agree. And also, for instance, there's been a lot of work of, for instance, the 2016 election talking about the so-called white working class and how that really is an amalgam of many different individuals that all don't think the same way either, but they're going to have most likely similar experiences. But we try to essentialize them as let's say, a voting block. We're going to be surprised when they don't vote that certain way. Let's say, for instance, like Latinx or Hispanic individuals in the U.S. Very diffuse, very diverse amount of individuals. But then every year, people are surprised that Cubans in Florida vote Republican when they're looking at the amount of individuals that are Hispanic or Latinx voting in elections. Because not every Hispanic individual or Latinx individual thinks the same way. They don't have the same life experiences.
Yeah.
So to sort of talk about individuals as these sort of, okay, white people do this or Latinx people do this is never going to work. You can try to generalize like that and probably make decently accurate assumptions, but there's always going to be something to go in contrast to that also too. Yeah, I mean, also in terms of, let's even talk about linguistic anthropology and pragmatics and like sort of the uses of words, operationalizing them to certain effects. We're talking about Black Lives Matter movements. For instance, Fox News might call that a riot, while CNN might call that a protest.
Yeah.
And that very strategic use of that term riot is going to negatively bias individuals listening to the discussions of Black Lives Matter, say, oh, that's a bad thing. They are rioting. They're not protesting. And that sort of gets institutionalized and intergenerationalized also too, to start hand waving and saying that this is how this group of people acts. These are undeserving of, let's say, Social Security benefits, that sort of thing. And then when we look at the riots and the, I would even probably call it domestic terrorism that we're seeing at the Capitol building, people are calling that protests. Why is that a protest and not a riot? Right? Like that sort of name usage, operationalizing verbiage and definitions makes us think about the world in a certain way. Knowledge shapes belief, belief shapes knowledge and behaviors.
Yeah.
That even goes into like habitus. We're talking, bring in like Bourdieu as an example. People's expectations and the discourse that they interact with is going to shape their understanding of others and also how they interact with others and the world that they also live in too.
Spot on. It's
I don't know. I guess I'm curious, like as a psychologist or psychology major, do you have these sort of discussions like in the classes? I'm just curious.
No, honestly, I can't think of one that came up.
No. I guess. Do you think there's a space for that?
Maybe now there is, because I mean it's been quite a few years since I finished the program, and I feel like at that time, this whole, I think the postmodernism, becoming a more mainstream thing was maybe just barely hitting at that time. So I think now I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was already in the program, or the cohorts or the students are having these discussions already, which I'm sure they are. I wouldn't bet against it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I just get frustrated that anthropology likes to say that we're a very permeable discipline, but then we never really talk outside of these spaces either. So I think that we should be doing this sort of thing more. I mean, I know there's been a lot of push to like do like interdisciplinary research, but even just like talking is different, and I think also that too. And just sort of seeing how the different disciplines interface, or they contrast, or they work very well together outside of an academic research environment where, okay, we're doing this, we're looking at this variable or this hypothesis. I think that's the only way to sort of stop this continued siloing of perspectives in anthropology, and I think also in other disciplines too. I don't know, it's just frustrating.
And I think I'm starting to remember. I think we did have these sorts of discussions, but we just didn't know. Again, about postmodernism, we didn't label it that. That wasn't in our radar. We didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean,
I think we were having these discussions of again of how how we do have biases, how everyone has a different perspective, different reality. What I guess what is right or wrong. Yeah, we were having these sorts of discussions, but again, I guess not at this level that we're having at it now.
Well, I mean, even in the anthropological discipline, we don't always even use the same terms. Like, for instance, I mentioned constructivism. That's sort of seen as basically just postmodernism in a sense. And archaeology doesn't like to use either of those terms. They might say post-processual, which basically is just sort of postmodern thought in theory. But it's just like people just get this understanding that like these are bad words, but we're going to talk about it anyways. We'll just call it something else. And I see that all the time in anthropology, and it's just I think it stops discussions. I don't know. It's a point for me again where I just get frustrated, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that's a good point. And earlier you were talking about like grouping things, like grouping things in like this. These people say this, and these people believe this. Like like being surprised, I guess, that like Hispanic Latinos like voted a certain way in Florida or wherever, and I think especially recently, like looking at on like more right-leaning Twitter feeds or whatever, they talk about like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and critical race theory being like a really bad thing, right? And I think, interestingly enough, like Kendi's book, Stand from the Beginning, he talks about how like this inclination to want to group people together is like kind of a real big part of racism, right? Like if you tell someone that who's black that he's an idiot for voting for Republicans because he's voting against his own interest, and therefore like you're revoking his black card or whatever, like that's not cool. That's not a good thing, right? Like and I think that there's something about that that's really tangible, and I think kind of defines what the issues with our like current discourse around race and how to be racist comes about, right? And I think one thing that people sort of disagree with Kendi on is that like everyone can ultimately embody racism or be racist in a way, even like people of color. And I think a lot of people, especially in like ethnic studies and other departments, like kind of take him to task for that, just because there's like a difference in like who can be racist. And I guess I wonder like to what extent I guess you're privy to that like argument, and I guess like how you kind of see that playing into maybe like anthropology or your approach to it.
Well, I think this kind of goes into a couple different scholars, but for instance, William, you'd be familiar with Clarence Gravely talking about how we can't just not talk about race, right? Like
Right.
we're still playing their game if we don't talk about race. Because then we're allowing other perspectives, other viewpoints, let's say racist viewpoints, to sort of percolate and permeate. So if we're not being explicitly anti-racist, which also is sort of the critical race theory perspective in that regard, we're kind of just implicitly allowing these power structures and these historical inadequacies and inequalities and health insecurities to sort of keep doing what they're doing. And that also kind of ties into feminist theory and thought, and this like the patriarchy as an example of that too. If you don't actively try to bring to light how the patriarchy is toxic and is influencing experiences of others negatively, then you're kind of implicitly promoting it. And that's the same thing that I think in terms of race discourse. If you're not being explicitly anti-racist, then individuals that have a racist perspective or are racist are able to have a bigger venue in which to speak in that regard. Now, I would also say that anthropology, I think, given again talking about Gravely, has been historically really uncomfortable talking about race after they said race is bad. And more recently, we've been trying to say race is bad, obviously, talking about it, but it's going to have real consequences whether or not we engage with it or not. So, if, for instance, there are inequalities that shape the health experiences or the healthful wellness of, let's say, Black males with high blood pressure, if we don't say that's because of them growing up in a food insecure environment, them experiencing racism, then individuals that take a more, let's say, hardline biological stance may say it's something in the genetics or something in the behavior of the Black male in this case, and not so much because their agency was constrained. They had limited options. They lived in a food desert or a food swamp that was making them at a higher risk for these health conditions. And that also is going to apply more broadly to health behaviors too. We talk about health and the medical anthropologist, but that's going to apply to behavior in general also too. And again, if we're expecting, let's say, a Black male to act a certain way, that itself is a racist sort of understanding of how people behave. If this is what Black men do, it's the same thing as saying this is what Hispanic individuals do or this is what Latinx individuals do. We're generalizing a concept that doesn't even really exist beyond it being a social construct, which is race in this example. So we're making it real by saying, this is what Black men do. This is what Black women do. We just say, that may be the case, but this is why. Or this is not the case because here's examples of this not being the case. And that's, again, generalizable. I think people just sort of get in their head that this means that everyone does this. No, it just means the general body does this one thing, right? That's what it means by definition. So there's going to always be exceptions to that rule. And even just acknowledging that from a postmodern perspective is very important because it, again, shows that people are not going to vote a certain way. We're not going to act a certain way. And I don't know, it's easy to essentialize, especially when you're looking at social media, because it's a venue that kind of promotes that sort of thought and behavior, and that sort of echo chamber we create for ourselves on social media. And it's also created for us by the tailoring, let's say, big data as an example, thinking, okay, this is what they want to see, that kind of thing. So that's where I think it also wraps back around to talking about BLM and talking about the domestic terrorism and riots that were happening a few days ago, predominantly by white males and in Washington. So I don't know. I just think that we need to be doing a better job at being anti-racist, of being an ally in general. Whether that's talking about LGBTQ plus issues, talking about race as a social construct and getting out what that actually means for people. But also how this still is a very real thing. We're not in a post-racial society, despite people saying that when Obama was president. It's just never going to be the case, given the history of the U.S. and the fact that race as a construct was developed largely to justify slavery. So we're still using the terminology because we're kind of forced to, unfortunately. But yeah, that's the case.
Yeah.
You know, I've been curious, like, how did we get to this point of making things just black and white? And yeah, I'm just I throw that question out to you guys. How did we get here? Well, why do we do this? Why are we unwilling to, I don't know, just get away from our biases and see that people will have different perspectives, different realities? Why? And where, you know, if the left is saying that anyone that votes for Trump is the devil or whatever, and vice versa, you know, it's, I've been thinking about that question.
Yeah.
Very dichotomous. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that dichotomous thinking, I think I want to say it's because it's just easy to do that. But that itself is me essentializing human behavior, and I don't want to do that. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like, on the one hand, it is just easier, and I think even like behaviorally, you want to be right? So if you're seeing people saying things that you agree with, you're going to probably talk to them more. It's just how humans sort of behave, again, to kind of essentialize human behavior. So I don't know. It's just like as we continue to fracture and silo people into boxes, we're kind of reproducing the whole negative context in which we are seeing, and it's going to get progressively worse potentially also too, as for instance media takes a stronger hold on us and we sort of get placed into a box and stay in that box too. And I think we're at the stage now where we have to start thinking and doing things that kind of address that. And I think so far we're doing a pretty poor job. We're just now starting to talk about white males as an example, as a body that needs to be studied and understood and approached to talk about health issues also too. So even paralleling my own work, talking about, let's say, Zika virus, to bring it back to the top, what I have found and what I'm kind of moving towards now is, since reproductive and sexual health issues is always so hyper focused on women, men have kind of been at the periphery of the discussion. So from what I have seen and what I kind of am hypothesizing is that men really don't care about it, as I was saying at the very top of the program, because it's not a concern for them because it has never been pitched to them as a concern. If the Belizean government is only saying pregnant women need to be concerned about Zika, pregnant women shouldn't get pregnant right now because of Zika virus, pregnant women should get tested because of Zika virus, men say, okay, well, I guess it's a woman's issue. And they don't get tested. They don't care about transmitting the disease. They don't care about, for instance, getting bit by a mosquito that can give them Zika virus. And until we engage with men, which is funny to say because predominantly research, since its inception as a body of work called research, has usually focused on men. But then there was a period of time where we said, okay, well, these are just men. Let's focus on women. And then men, again, need to be kind of wrapped back in to our work, because if we don't engage with them, then we get in context where we are unprepared to kind of address what we're seeing right now in terms of, let's say, white males that are very right-leaning. Not a lot of work on them. Why is that the case? Because they've always been assumed as like, well, they're the top of the privileged food chain, so we don't need to do work with them. But then that creates a context again where we're missing out on very valuable data on that topic to be able to potentially address it too. So I don't know. I just think that we need to be doing more always. And I think right now we're just doing a poor job at getting to the issue before it becomes an issue and it starts to boil over.
Yeah.
What we're seeing right now.
Hmm.
I'm sure right now there are plenty of projects that are trying to be pitched for funding, engaging with white males that are heavily conservative. Why wasn't that happening before? It wasn't the focus of people's minds until it becomes an issue.
Yeah.
That's how Will said, until you actually see it out in the streets, in the real world.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's got to be a problem for it to be a research problem.
Yeah.
I guess it's got to be a problem to get funding. I guess so I don't know. That's the game we play, unfortunately. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we've had you for like an hour. I appreciate you getting to talk to you. I don't know if you have like a final word.
I would say love each other and try to be more postmodern. Don't have to be postmodern, but be more postmodern.
Yeah.
That's what I would end it with.